that it's been a year since the start of the lockdown, even though it's probably felt more like 20, and it's impacted, well, everybody. Impacted our health, impacted our economy and our incomes. Mounting evidence that the economic lockdown also hurt women far more than men. What happens to SMMEs, though, and can they possibly come back? Well, to speak to us about this, Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko is a development economist at the University of Stellenbosch, the business school there. Lings Naidoo is the director and co-founder of the organization BeyondCovid, looking at trying to help small businesses. Dr. Moleko, I'm going to start with you, if I may. If we look at the numbers, it really seems that women lost more money during the pandemic than men. Why did this happen?
Sure, that's a very pointed question. I think let me start with that fact. The results show that, I think initially there's the National Income Dynamic Study. It really showed us that 66% of the first initial losses, particularly with job losses, hit hardest, it was women. So there's an income loss for women and their children, particularly because South Africa has a large proportion of women who are breadwinners, okay? And I think the concentration as well of job losses is particularly more so in women. And you asked the question, why? I think the reason is the structure of our labor market. Many of our people are within the informal economy. They're also in what we call, I think, temporary work, right? Informal work or semi-skilled, because they're semi-skilled laborers, they're not necessarily in permanent work and permanent structures. And you find that in the main being women. And I'll use the example of domestic workers. So without social assistance during COVID, they the main ones affected by loss of income if they are laid off. They don't have access to UIF. They don't have access to some of the social benefits, particularly if they were not registered. So these are some of the things you're finding from the research, that there is a gender dynamic to the effect of COVID, and it hasn't necessarily been focused on. And so poverty is worsening, particularly on female-headed households, on those in the informal economy, and on those who are hardest hit with job losses. The data is showing us that there is a gender dynamic, and women are hardest hit.
How much of this is also simply about childcare? Schools were closed for a long period. ECD centres, so creches, nursery schools, closed for an even longer period. In some cases, I think some still haven't had the subsidies that they need. And men, of course, I mean, you know, go to work. Whether they should or not is a bigger question, but they leave the children behind with the women, and that's had a bigger impact on them as well.
So you've raised a very important point of childcare responsibilities. In the society that we're living in, the primary caregiver and the one who's usually responsible for the child, particularly when lockdown happened, it would be the mother of the children. So imagine you're a single mother, you have to look after the children, you may lose the income that you even need to support your household. And so the burden lies on you. That's number one. I think the second thing is that because many are in the informal economy, the stats are telling us 54% of our households entered the informal employment sector. That again means that if there's lockdown conditions, you cannot necessarily leave the house, you cannot make money, again you're harder hit. So what this means, and there's a UNDP report that measured the widening levels of poverty. So we've got upper bound level poverty. That meant that more people fell into hunger poverty as a proportion of the whole, and a bigger proportion of our people moved out of the middle class into vulnerability. So people actually got poorer during COVID, and again there's a gender dynamic. So I think there's very real realities that the situation of the patriarchal society that we're living in, we do have a gender dynamic to the economic impact of COVID, primarily because the burden of childcare rests on the woman. And if you don't have a support structure, you are likely to be harder hit.
Lings Naidoo, I mean, we're looking at recovering beyond COVID. That's the name of the organization that you helped to found. I mean, we are looking at trying to get as many people who are able to work, who are able to maybe run a small business as an SME going again. And again, I imagine we might find that women may find it harder to access capital than men, and may just for other reasons actually find it harder to run a small business again, possibly because of the childcare issue.
Certainly. So you mentioned a couple of important points there, Stephen. With regards to SMMEs, let's start with the economy in general. You know, the survey that we've run, which was national, covered all types of businesses and sectors. What it indicates very clearly is there is a slight sign of recovery, and I guess that's very encouraging. I guess in these times in particular, we need some good news stories. So if you look at businesses that are operating as business as usual, when we started the survey around the start of the pandemic, the percentage that you were looking at was 20%. It's now moved up slightly to 21%. If you look at businesses that were closed around the start of the pandemic, 23%, that's now dropped to the same percentage, 21% as well. So there are signs of recovery. With regards to where the recovery is taking place, that's where the tacky hits the tarmac. And although we don't have gender-specific numbers, with regards to SMMEs, if you look at the percentage of corporates that are operating as business as usual, that figure is 44%. The corresponding figure for SMMEs is much less, 17%. So around a third of the percentage of corporates for SMMEs. If you look at closures, the distinction is even worse. So 1% of corporates are now closed compared to the 22% that were closed around the start of the pandemic, so 1%. And the figure for SMMEs is 26%. So 26 SMMEs are 26 times more likely to be closed now than corporates are. And I think that highlights the distinction very succinctly between corporates who are bouncing back nicely, coming out of COVID, whereas SMMEs, their condition has worsened slightly and by no means out of the woods. Now, as Nthabiseng pointed out, in the informal sector in particular, there are quite a lot of women that, are at the forefront of the informal sector. And certainly, they'd be experiencing the same disadvantages that SMMEs are. And that's where our organization comes in, because I believe, there are some simple things we can do, simple but hard things that can be done to help both women in business and, other genders in business to actually bounce back.
So what do we do? And I mean, the conversation around structural reform could almost be summed up like that. There'll be some people who would say there are a few simple but hard things to do. So what do we do to help SMMEs particularly?
We've done a lot of work on the situation with SMMEs, looking into the informal sector as well. And the thing I think that we must note up front is there are a lot of good organizations there that are focusing on doing the right things. So if you look at an organization like CEDA as an example, they really put a lot of focus into training up SMMEs. If you look at private sector, you have enterprise development programs that are quite well-meaning and well-intentioned in terms of what they want to achieve with SMMEs. What we find the key distinction is, Stephen, and this is particularly more relevant during COVID, is that you need to provide 360 degrees of support. So as an example, an organization like the IDC, or maybe a better example, an organization like CIFA will provide funding, and that's a critical component that SMMEs need. An organization like CEDA, as I mentioned, will provide training. And then you'll have other organizations like municipalities will provide stalls that informal sector businesses can trade out of. Those are three elements that are quite prevalent in terms of support. But we find where SMMEs tend to fall short is on three other areas. So just to highlight them very quickly, we call them enabling services, enabling technology, and step change. Now, enabling services, a good example of that is an organization like the Jobs Fund, which supports an organization called the Urban Agriculture Initiative. And what the Urban Agriculture Initiative does is it supports emerging farmers, but through a structure called an SMME collective. Now, the way it works is that in SMME farmers, where they struggle is getting access to inputs, access to things like packaging, so when their product ends up on the shelf at SPAR, it can hold its own against other products that are well packaged and that feel safe to eat. It helps in terms of access to technology. So if you think of an emerging farmer, one of the big mistakes they make is planting the wrong crop at the wrong time. So what the Urban Agriculture Initiative does is they help with soil analysis so they determine the ideal crop to be planted. Something else they do is in urban settings, they allow people to farm on top of rooftops, and to be able to do that, you need access to hydroponics technology. Now, the most important element, and I'll close with this, in terms of what will make a difference to SMMEs, is what we call step change. See, the thing we don't want to do is be a crutch that an SMME is forever destined to have to balance themselves on to stay upright. What you want to do is you want to graduate them from an informal sector trader to a small trader to a commercial operation. In the farming space, that would be subsistence farmer or emerging farmer, smallholder farmer, and then moving up to commercial farmer. And if you provide what we call this 360-degree enabling environment, you then fundamentally change the dynamics, and it's a systemic change that you were talking about. The nice thing about it is it puts the power with the SMMEs, so they form together in collectives, they create the scale, and with support from organizations like BeyondCovid, can access the capabilities that fundamentally move them out of that, subsistence, hanging around for handouts situation to where they move into the commercial space, so they become bankable. So no, I know that's quite a few mouthfuls, and as I said, in concept simple, not easy to do, and that's where I think organizations like ours can play a key role in making that difference.
Dr. Moleko, I mean, this period has shown us so much about how our country and our economy actually works. It's shown us how vulnerable people are. I mean, I still shudder, actually, at times when I go to bed at night, when I remember the numbers during the hard lockdown of how many people were going to bed hungry, sometimes just to make sure their children had enough to eat, and their children still didn't have enough to eat. What it really boils down to is that it shows you how much work needs to be done in our economy. We've known that we've had to do this work for a very long time. Dr. Moleko, are we any closer to having that kind of work being done, so when hopefully the vaccine rollout gets going, we'll actually start to see a change?
I do want to say that if we accept that the effect of COVID is not equal, i.e. it affects the rich and the middle class differently, it affects the poor to the well-off. Even within the poor, there's different layers, right? We're talking about the transient poor, the chronic poor. And so the measures or the response has got to be very targeted. We've also got to accept that there's a formal and an informal economy, right? So the formal economy, we've seen the credit guarantee schemes and the tax deferral and all these high-level measures in mass. So we've seen a 200 billion, for an example, in the capital markets, given to formal, particularly more your medium-sized and your larger-scale companies. But we haven't seen to the same scale and the same degree, the same type of support in terms of liquidity for your informal sector and targeted interventions for smaller and what we call micro enterprises that deal with boosting economic activity for those on the lower scale. So the dualism in the South African economy has got to have a different approach. And I think, Stephen, the second thing is the targeted approach for the gender sensitivity effect. So we've seen with the credit guarantee scheme that it's going largely to multinationals, and SMMEs and micro are not the beneficiaries. Same with some of the guarantee schemes. From a gender perspective, the main beneficiaries, more than 2/3 of some of these the grants are going to men. But the biggest and the hardest hit from COVID are the women. So there's a bit of a disjointedness there. And unless you have I'd say employment guarantee schemes and targeted interventions where we talk about agriculture, manufacturing, where we make sure that women beneficiaries are not a maybe, but a targeted and mandatory beneficiary to the schemes, to the benefits of the capital and the allocation of liquidity. And until we do that, we will have a permanent loss of people to informal and semi or unskilled work, temporary work, out of the formal economy, out of permanent jobs that don't necessarily recover. So I think I would say from an economic policy perspective, let's focus on primary and secondary sector contribution. Let's focus on DFIs targeting women, informal sector. Let's focus on making sure we increase our value add across the provinces in South Africa, particularly the lower nodes where poverty is over and unemployment is over 42%, Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, Mpumalanga, KwaZulu-Natal. Eastern Cape is sitting at 51%, and most of those are the youth. So there's a dynamic there where there's a gender, a youth, an age dynamic, but also a locality issue. So we've got to look at these things and do them. I am hopeful. We can do these things. We've got the ideas. We've got people like you asking what should be done. There are people listening right now to say what interventions can be done. And I have hope that we will get this right if we constantly put forth some policy mechanisms that can deal with the real structural reform that says, let's double manufacturing value add, let's get more people working, and let's have a gendered approach to some of our interventions so that we can deal with the hardest hit and deal with the recovery of those who've lost, but also the pre-COVID crises that we're all facing. So I am hopeful.
Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, as always, thanks very much indeed. Lings Naidoo, do appreciate the time. Plenty of conversations to come around the economy, the genderized impact of the economy, but more important than that, what is to be done.